All right, I'm back. Well, I guess I'm back if you're watching this part 2 of the Introduction and Overview for Environmental Economics right after you watched part 1. In any event, I still got my graphs up here from part 1 because as I was preparing to do the part 2 video, it occurred to me that these were sort of overriding factors in my discussion of some of the issues. So, I may want to point back and forth to it, but nothing new here that we haven't already gone over. But maybe that'll help right here in the context of what we want to go over. Let's start by talking about some trade-offs and the fact that they're pretty much ever present, and that the environmental trade-offs aren't just between the environment and producing more stuff, materialism and having faster cars and cheaper televisions and all that other stuff. It seems to be what the main environmental trade-offs are. But in fact, there are environmental trade-offs to environmental solutions. One that seems to come up quite often is the marginal social cost being more than the marginal private cost for wind-generated power. Wow. I bet you didn't think of wind-generated power as a source of pollution. Well, the fuel, the wind, of course, isn't pollution. In fact, the more the wind there is, if there's any other emissions, they blow away. But what we mean when there's marginal social costs, higher than marginal private costs, for something like wind power, it means that there are impacts on third parties. And in this case, impacts in the form of environmental effects on third parties that result from generating electricity by using wind power. Namely, that when you erect the towers, you do at least two things. Some of the nearby landowners protest vehemently because you've created some aesthetic pollution. I think that things are ugly because they have to look at them and it reduces their property values. And so by our earlier definition of pollution problems, you have created some potential uncompensated damage that either you have to conceal the wind towers better or not have them at all, or have fewer of them, locate them better, or compensate the landowners for the damage done to them, namely having to look at these things to address the pollution problem. And then the other form of pollution is that it turns out that wind power, these turbines that are rotating to generate electricity from wind, kill birds and bats. And the bats tend to be pollinators of a lot of plants, so that has a secondary environmental effect, namely not as much production of the plants, and therefore the animals that depend on those plants. You see kind of a cascading effect. One thing leads to another of the things that the bats, if they'd been alive, would have otherwise pollinated. All right, so, gosh, I thought wind power was a solution to, an alternative to, generating power by electricity, power by burning coal or burning oil or burning natural gas or splitting atoms, nuclear power that definitely has this profile, right? MSC is bigger than MPC for nuclear power because, well, there's this waste storage issue, right? And then there's the risk of terrorism or other reasons that might cause the radioactive fuel to be exposed, for people to become exposed to the radioactive fuel. Or when you remember Japan had the earthquake, and nuclear power plants require lots of cooling water. They tend to be on the coast. Whammo, the tsunami from the hurricane hit the power plants and caused some radiation to be released from some of them. All right, so, wow, you thought it was so clean and easy to compare these alternatives. Wow, wind and solar, well, there's no pollution from them. Well, maybe not air pollution, but other kinds. Death to bats, death to birds, reduced production of plants, reduced aesthetics that we avoid by having distant coal-burning power plants, distant nuclear power plants. We don't have to look at them, and we can focus all of the power generation on their relatively few acres rather than having acres and acres of wind turbines or photovoltaic cells from which to generate solar power. It's rough out there. There are no easy answers. There are only some that work better and some places another. Another dimension of wind power that we have to take into account is it's not always windy. So how do we deliver a steady stream of power on demand when the wind is anything but steady? Well, we have to have an on-demand, standby, ready at a moment's notice alternative source of power. And one of the first sources or uses of wind power occurred near huge hydroelectric dams. And the way that they integrated those was that when the wind abated a little bit and the turbines turned slower, they let a little more water through the turbines of the dam, and so they generated more electricity through water, through hydroelectric. When it was less windy, the combination of the two, integrated by computer, maintained a steady source of power. Of course, that assumes that the water has its highest priority is to generate electricity when it's not windy. There are other uses of the power, namely recreation on a lake. If we dedicate the water to making up for when it's not windy, the lake level is likely to be variable, which interferes with water recreation. Anyway, the point is endless trade-offs. And, of course, it's not always water isn't always equally abundant. Yes, it may be a big lake, and so that evens out the water inflow from one year to the next, although that may cause drastic drops or increases in changes in lake level. Anyway, again, more trade-offs. Now, continuing that way of thinking, what if we want to build wind power and utilize windy places, build wind power turbines, generate electricity from wind in places where there aren't any obvious places to build dams to store water to generate electricity for when it's not windy? And that may restrict wind power to certain places because it may be too expensive to provide alternate standby electricity sources in some places, more in some places than others. For example, it's not easy to turn on or off certain kinds of power plants, like nuclear power plants. Just turning those on and off for when it's windy and not windy, that just doesn't work. It's just too expensive. And that's true to some extent of coal-fired plants as well. We have gas turbine plants that are easy to turn on and off. In fact, that's how we meet electricity on hot days when electricity demand peaks in mid-afternoon with high temperatures and demand for air conditioning. And so, yes, we can turn on and off gas turbines to make up for when it's not windy, but gas turbines are very expensive ways to generate electricity. So that means that wind electricity, for reasons of its own and for reasons of maintaining steady production of electricity, makes that pretty expensive. And then now we can visit the notion of pretty expensive. What do we mean by that? Does the price per kilowatt hour that we see on our electricity bill, is that a complete picture, or are there hidden costs that if we took account of those would make wind energy look more attractive? Well, so far the bird and bat killing and the aesthetics has been a hidden cost that makes wind power even more expensive in some places. But what about hidden costs that may not be taken into account in the use of coal or oil or natural gas or nuclear energy? A lot of people will tell you that despite environmental regulations and various kinds of taxes and fees that we haven't fully internalized, included in the price of electricity, all the costs of relying on coal, global warming threats, or relying on oil, being vulnerable to cut off from foreign sources, although that's less of an issue than it used to be because of the fracking technology has made it possible to produce more oil within the United States, less reliance on foreign energy. Okay, so anyway, some of you are probably like, wow, there's a lot to take account. Yeah, you have some idea of why a lot of people working in this area have full-time jobs. It's not so easy to say, well, duh, let's use this instead of this. It makes more sense in some places, like water combined with wind as a generation source makes more sense to use wind turbines to generate electricity than in other areas. Maybe the aesthetic factor is more of a big deal in some places than others. So those are places to generate less electricity by wind power than it is in other areas. So anyway, these are major issues. Maybe we can take this same issue a little closer to home. I know that some of the people that may be watching this video don't live in San Antonio or are new residents of San Antonio, Texas. And so you may not be able to relate to this. All right, well, now you get an education in some of the issues that exist here. But one of the reasons that we've had our pumpage restricted from our primary water source in San Antonio, the Edwards Aquifer, is because Endangered Species Act considerations have mandated that we keep the aquifer pretty full most of the time so that more water will spill out of these spring openings that tend to occur pretty high elevation-wise in our aquifer. In other words, if we allowed ourselves to have varying levels in the aquifer, which has a lot of water in it, the springs would go dry from time to time, and the species that rely on those flows would struggle to survive or have to be kept alive temporarily from time to time off-site in a zoo environment and then put back in the springs. That's unacceptable to some people. It should be natural spring flow that keeps these critters alive. My point is that that's an expensive consideration. And the effect isn't just in the almighty dollar because it drives up the cost of water because we can't pump as much from the aquifer. But if we have to keep the Edwards Aquifer full to generate natural spring flow, where are we going to get our water from? Well, we can still pump some water for the aquifer, but we may have to trap the water that comes out of the springs behind big dams once it comes out of the springs in order to still use that water. So now instead of pumping it out of the aquifer where it's protected from being evaporated by the intense South Texas sun, now it's out in the open downstream of the springs in big lakes, captured behind big dams. It has a big dollar cost. It's not cheap to build big dams, and that's important to take into account. But now let's talk about environmental trade-offs that already exist in many rivers, river basins in Texas, namely because we have so much water trapped behind these big dams on various Texas rivers, and might add them to the rivers that come out of the springs, that come out of the Edwards Aquifer for the San Antonio region part of Texas. If we do that, then there'll be reduced water flow to the coastal areas, the coastal estuaries, which are rich in terms of environmental and natural resources and wildlife factors that all depend on the river flow being maintained into these coastal areas. If that's diminished because of the evaporative losses, because of these big dams trapping the water that comes out of the dams in order to utilize some of that, instead of utilizing it while it's still underground, now we have some big environmental trade-offs in terms of losses of wildlife habitat, like in production of shrimp and fish, because of the loss of some of that coastal inflow from freshwater rivers. All right, so there we have not only big bucks to build the dams as a factor to consider in how much water we pump from the aquifer and whether we manage it to stay full or not so full. We have some not only big dollar costs, but some environmental trade-offs to consider. All right, so as you consider some of these issues, you've really got to be ready to ask a lot of questions. You've got to be aware of who's doing the presenting, and you've got to be aware of spin. You've got to be aware of the basis of the claims being made, the underlying institutions that generate the data, that generate the behavior that's being described is critical, because otherwise you might jump to completely nutty conclusions. You might jump to the conclusion that the enemy is capitalism, and that the enemy is greedy corporations. We need the cops, some kind of environmental cops, to punish these folks. That we need a lot of command and control regulations to keep these greedy corporations and reckless users of goods and services from getting away with this environmental carnage. What may be at issue is simply poorly defined, unenforced private property rights. I described this a little bit in my Part 1 video. Namely, that if we make it free to dispose of wastes in one way and make it costly to dispose of wastes in more environmentally conscious ways, that competitive markets will drive the producers to naturally prefer to stay more competitive, to keep their prices lower by utilizing the unowned and therefore unpriced sources. And so the problem may be that we've presented the producers, these supposedly evil corporations that are just trying to stay competitive in their marketplace, with a set of choices that they shouldn't have. And maybe the solution isn't to restrict their access to the unowned and unpriced source of waste disposal capacity, but to make that waste disposal capacity owned and priced. Maybe it should be publicly owned and priced. Maybe it should be privately owned and priced. So how would we privately own and price the ability to process wastes and dispose of them? Well, how about having a finite amount of waste disposal capacity defined and assigning private property to some share of that overall capacity? Say we determine that a particular river has the ability to process 100,000 gallons of a certain kind of waste without any noticeable impact on the river quality or waste. So then we allocate shares in that ability to process that much waste and let those shares be bought and sold in private markets. The government's only role in that market, which if you may have recognized it, that's called cap and trade. The government's only role in that kind of a market is to make sure that the users of these limited resources don't exceed the amount that they've purchased. Namely, let's say they've purchased access to 1,000 out of the 100,000 gallons per year of waste disposal capacity, that to monitor their use of that resource, that they don't dispose of more than 1,000 gallons. And that if they want to dispose of more than 1,000 gallons, that they buy from someone else at a market price some of their ability to access that waste disposal capacity, so that if somebody disposes of more, somebody else has to dispose of less. All right, so unenforced, undefined, unowned, unpriced property rights may be the villain. Rules that, as I noted in my first video, might at one point have been perfect because there was no scarcity, now are no longer appropriate or anything but perfect because now there is scarcity, that there's overuse of the environment's ability to process waste if that right is not privatized. Other issues that may arise in the claims about certain environmental problems and whether they're severe or not severe may be a difference between urban and rural. Maybe in a rural environment there's no problem, again, maybe because it's not scarce. Maybe in an urban environment the described behavior is problematic because of the population density around. Maybe the problem is not due to unenforced property. Well, maybe it's unenforced. Maybe it's not due to lack of private property rights or unowned and unpriced. It may be that it's unenforced. Okay, this is an issue that comes up a lot in the difference between developed countries and developing countries, which is typically an optimistic and perhaps overly optimistic term. Unfortunately, many so-called developing countries have been in the process of being way short of developed for a long time because of corruption. If you want a one-word explanation for why some places are poor and others are not, the usual one word would be corruption. And a longer description of the same thing, which is important, is that you have crony capitalism rather than the real McCoy, which is real capitalism, an arm's length pursuit of self-interest, which is constrained by private property rights and clean exercise of power, the rule of law, where the courts don't favor somebody over somebody else because they have connections. No one is above the law. all are treated evenly by the law. That's real capitalism. And there's a big difference between real capitalism and crony capitalism. When people mistake the two and they assume that one is the same as the other, they sometimes centrally control the economy. They impose central planning on free enterprise, which to a lot of people this looks like pure chaos. But no, free enterprise is anything but chaos. It's guided by the price system. It's guided by property rights. It's guided by price change. But when there's crony capitalism and you can't count on the judges to enforce contracts, and when the rule of law depends on who you are and not whether you've broken the law that applies to everybody or not, you get some big differences in behavior and you get some big problems because, as it turns out, free enterprise, real capitalism, not crony capitalism, generates the wealth and the prosperity that causes people to allocate resources and to care more about environmental problems than they would if you had corruption, which results from crony capitalism, and therefore poverty, and therefore low demand for income elastic environmental protection efforts that sometimes are costly. And that's so people have to say, I'm willing to pay to have, for example, the visibility at the Grand Canyon to be better than it otherwise would. I'm willing to pay a little bit more for electricity in order to have it look like this, a picture where you can see the bottom of the Grand Canyon, versus this, and somebody's holding up another picture that here's what it would look like if we don't pay for a little bit more for electricity, which would cover the cost of reducing emissions or making sure that the emissions are not as dirty looking as they otherwise would be. All right, so we have a short-term issue where we might mistake the cause of some environmental problems for capitalism, or whether resources are publicly owned and maybe not very good enforcement, or privately owned or publicly owned with good enforcement of those property rights, to where users of the property have to pay a market-determined rates that limits the use of the resource to that which is sustainable. We might create a long-term problem in that we have poverty, which creates low demand for environmental protections and low ability to pay for them. That might create long-term problems. Stepping back from the issues just a little bit, we discover that in places that have real capitalism, or as close as we can see, with as little corruption as exists on planet Earth, we see that that's where the environment tends to be better. That the environment is a disaster in places like communist places or the former socialist places behind the Soviet Union, former in parts of China, former Red China, some parts of it are still as communist as they used to be, and still then suffer from environmental problems that are much more severe than in other places where we have private property and free enterprise. And indeed, because a lot of the earth is governed by free enterprise and by real capitalism, we see that the true state of the planet is actually improving. You wouldn't think that from a lot of the alarmism that you read and hand-wringing about imminent climate change and other things. There's some real environmental problems out there. Don't misunderstand me. But overall, things are getting better. The United States has a lot more forest cover on it than it used to. Why is that? Well, for some somewhat strange reasons. It's because we're relying more on fertilizers, pesticides, tractors. You think, whoa, wait a minute, that doesn't sound environmentally friendly. Well, yeah, there's some environmental problems that go into producing fertilizers and building tractors and creating pesticides. But when we use them, we can meet our demand for food on a lot fewer acres than we used to, and therefore we can leave a lot more land undisturbed and therefore have trees and wildlife on them, whereas before we needed that land to produce food. And so even though there's a lot more of us than there used to be, and so a greater demand for food, we meet that demand for more food on fewer acres than we used to need with lesser technology and not so effective pesticide and fertilizer and herbicide. So, some interesting conclusions, some interesting issues, that some things that don't sound so environmentally friendly, hard, you may have read that reading already, hard versus soft ways to do things. sometimes the hard ways to do things, nuclear power, using coal to make electricity, oil to do things, are a lot more environmentally friendly in the long run than the soft approaches, which, for example, like wind power that we've been discussing, consume a lot more land than the hard approaches, say, like nuclear power do. I'm not taking any sides on any of these things. What I'm telling you is that there are trade-offs that are not always all that obvious, and so we need environmental economics to flesh out what those trade-offs are so that the policymakers who will consider efficiency, but not just efficiency, will at least be able to put some price tags, some efficiency losses. They'll be able to look at what maximizes efficiency, and then if they don't like that picture for some reason, they'll be able to use the price tags of, hey, less efficiency will be the cost of some of these other things that we would like to do. So, we have seen some self-destruction on the Earth. There are places on the Earth that are where the underground water no longer exists because the underground reservoirs have collapsed because we sucked out too much of the water. There's sinkholes all over the place. So now we have to rely on other things, and we have all this damage that would not have otherwise existed if we'd had adequate institutions in time. There are places that are overfished, and not only would coastal communities be better off, but we would have more and better fish to consume and at lower prices if we had addressed the institutional issues, namely, go take the fish if you can find them, and that worked fine for a long time, but not when there were too many fishing boats and more people. If we had addressed those earlier, we would have a lot better situation in the fishing communities and in fish markets than we have now. So we've seen some self-destruction, and that's produced some pessimistic models about how economic systems and political systems combine in combinations. And these models haven't performed all that well, but maybe it's just that we haven't reached the limits that they've said exist yet. And so let's not just totally dismiss those. Maybe there is a limit. I think about this, for example, especially often when I think about population growth. We're at 7 billion and counting. Are things going to keep getting better, or at least not any worse as population grows? So far, that's been the case, but maybe at some point, at least in terms of some things for which there are no substitutes, things like scenic places, national parks, and wilderness areas, maybe some of those will begin to be jeopardized, at least for some people. Because, for example, if we use price systems to ration out what's available, it's going to get increasingly expensive to visit a national park, right? Because there's only one of them. There are no true substitutes for them, at least for some of these unique places, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon. Yeah, maybe you think of it as if I don't go there, I can go somewhere else and still have a nice experience. All right, so maybe kind of indirect substitutes, but if we ration those strictly by a price mechanism, some people are never going to visit some wilderness areas and national parks, so they just don't have the money to do it. Some people poo-poo that because they say, look, if you've got the money to get to these places in the first place, you've got the money to pay any likely entrance fee that would ration the amount available. Let me give you another example. There's this really cool place, I think it's barely in Arizona, it's near the border. They ration, the owners, the Bureau of Land Management, ration access to that by first come, first serve. Now, that means I'm likely to never see that place. My time is too scarce to go to that Bureau of Land Management office that has jurisdiction over that really cool place in really northern Arizona, almost Utah. And so pretty much, unless you live there and you can stand there all day in line and maybe still strike out, that all the permits are gone before your place comes up. Unless you're one of those folks, you may never get to see that place. Is that a better rationing mechanism than, hey, BLM has costs, has a budget. Maybe instead of making the taxpayers pay for that, maybe we should generate some of that budget by charging whatever the market will bear to see this really cool place. And, we don't want to damage it, so we can only let X number of people go there. And at that restriction, we can charge $100 a person per day to go there. And, wow, that's a lot of money. But, when you think about how much it costs for anybody that doesn't live there to go there, the $100 a day isn't very much compared to traveling days and days to get there from large population centers, which are mostly in the east. and then by golly, once you get there, you want to be able to get there, right? You travel from New York or Philadelphia or Chicago to this cool spot in northern Arizona, and then you discover after all that you can't get in because you didn't get in line in time. And you didn't have time to stand there for days and days while you're doing nothing other than hoping that your turn comes up before they run out of the permits. All right, so back to this notion of pessimism about there being real constraints on how much of something we can do. There are limits to growth. Maybe we'll just keep on finding ways to substitute for most things. And some things, well, if there aren't any substitutes, we can do some combination of what the market will bear for most folks and some sort of limited allocation we give away to make sure we don't exclude all the low-income people from it. And then again, maybe since we so far have found substitutes and innovative ways to cope with scarcity and make switches at the last minute when we're about to run out of something, if we are, to something that we can serve in there, maybe the optimistic model is appropriate. Maybe there really aren't any real scarcities, and if we just let the price system, by scarcities I mean ultimate scarcities where we're going to run out of something, if we just let the price system work, that will motivate innovation, high prices, motivate discovery of substitutes, and at the same time will restrict access to what the environment can bear. Some combination of substitution and innovation is likely to continue to result from the price system exacting its toll through higher prices and then lower prices once we find an alternative that's cheap through technology or just discovery. What we need then is to just be really clear and complete in our comparisons of the different alternatives. Let me just list some of the alternatives, and some of those I've already listed just because I keep going off on tangents to provide illustrations. But we think of coal now as a really dirty fuel and as a problem. But it wasn't all that long ago, 100 and something years ago, that it was a solution. How can coal be an environmental solution? Well, at the time, people were using trees for fuel and were using wood to build things. And when coal came along, we were able to build things from steel because we could use the coal to help make the iron to build the steel. We no longer was relying on wood, so we didn't have to cut down as many trees. And we could use the fuel from coal, the coal as a fuel, to provide heat, to heat our homes, to not freeze to death in places like Northern Europe, which is, if you look at a map, it's pretty darn far north and it's cold there. And likewise for many parts of North America and the United States. It gets cold in the wintertime, and even in much of the spring and fall, you want home heating. And before there was coal, that meant cut down trees for wood, or at least if you didn't have to cut down trees, you were lucky to just haul out all the dead wood in the forest. All right, so coal emerged as an alternative to wood. That was an environmental blessing at the time. But now with population growth and, at least initially, failure to account for the effect of the emissions from coal, it was a problem. So then with the technology and the price, sort of the indirect price, the environmental effects as a motive, we developed alternatives to use of coal as a direct fuel and as an indirect fuel to generate electricity. Along came nuclear, natural gas, which is fairly environmentally benign, and nuclear, which is until there's an accident or the problems with the heated water, or until you store the waste and maybe something busts loose and the stored waste gets loose, until, that seems pretty environmentally benign. So now with terrorism as a problem, now we're starting to worry more about the waste storage sites. How secure are they? And, well, we haven't got so many waste storage sites yet. We're storing the waste from generating electricity through nuclear at nuclear power plants. Wow, how secure are those? Are terrorists likely to break in there? And, besides that, these nuclear power plants are close to the ocean. That makes them vulnerable to ocean events like tsunamis or just big storms, hurricanes. So there are all these issues to take account of. Maybe it would be better to focus back on the coal, which is still pretty abundant, but figure out some way to make it more benign as a fuel, to clean coal. If you Google that, will generate a lot of hits. That's A lot of programs try to make coal cleaner, but without making the cleanup process cost more energy than the energy that's in the burning of the coal to begin with. And of course, there's conservation. Okay, sure. Is that free? No, it costs money to figure out ways to do the same thing, but with fewer resources. So that's not a free alternative, but that's one that's definitely worth considering. Yeah, maybe it makes sense. And it's another thing that we get from higher prices is, okay, now we've generated an incentive to find ways to use the fuel more efficiently. As I said initially in my part 1 of this video series, this intro overview video series, natural resource environmental economics is price theory applied to environmental and natural resource issues and conflicts in the uses of resources that result once they're scarce. Maybe what we ought to do, since we know that central planning doesn't work, which means bureaucracy is deciding what we should do, how we should do it, where we should do it, and who gets what from the uses of the resource. We know that's a disaster. We know that just doesn't work. We know that it's fairly obvious once you study it that centrally allocating any resource, whether it be industry-wide or economy-wide, just generates huge information problems and huge incentive problems. So that being the case, if we just totally buy into that notion, then what we need to do, above all else, is to make sure that price systems can do their work, which means that price systems, to the best of our ability, completely account for all of the costs and benefits, which sometimes are negative. And remember, benefits are all the effects of doing something, some of which are bad and some of which are good. And the costs are the opportunity costs, compliance, and administration for doing things. Maybe we better make sure that prices are complete. Maybe that should be our main focus, and that we should leave the command and control regulation, which dampens the incentive to innovate. Okay, let me just give you a quick example of that, again, going off on a little tangent before I jump back to where I had been. What if we decide to mandate the use of best available control technology to reduce emissions? And we'll get back to this a little later in the semester, but just kind of a teaser, because we've been talking about incentives and why it's important to use price systems. So we mandate the use of best available control technology. Now that sounds good on its face, right? What could be better than somebody using the best available control technology to reduce emissions? But so now you've created a situation where somebody, once they've done that, has an incentive not to want to find even better ways to reduce emissions, or to find a way not to generate the emissions, or to generate the product in different ways that creates no emissions at all, or maybe fewer emissions, or maybe different kinds of emissions that are not bad. Once you mandate the use of a certain technology, the person in compliance doesn't want somebody to come up with a newer and better way to do that, because that means that what they've just done, right, complying, buying some technology, some machine that was required, is now no longer effective, or maybe isn't even legal anymore, right? Because now there's a better technology. Don't invent something new. I've got what is new. It's working, kind of, sort of. Maybe it could be better, but I'm in compliance now. Leave me alone, right? So if we just say, look, you figure out a way to do whatever you want, but if you create emissions, you've either got to pay a fee for using those emissions. You're using a scarce environmental resource. Okay? Pay for using it so that you don't use too much, so that total use doesn't exceed reasonable thresholds. Or we're going to have a cap and trade system where we just privatize access to the environment and make sure we don't privatize too much access, so that we stay within reasonable environmental thresholds. Let the price system do its work. Now, when might you want to use a command and control system? Well, price systems do what? They allocate a limited quantity, okay, to the highest value uses. Cool, right? Now, what if the quantity that you want to allocate is zero? Really toxic stuff. Maybe you don't want to allocate the right to release a certain amount of plutonium or botulism into the air. Right? Maybe that's just fine for carbon dioxide because, hey, I just exhaled a little bit of it, and I don't want to be told that I can't do that, right? Because then I drop dead. We want to have the right to have some carbon dioxide emissions, right? Because that's just a normal part of biological activity. But botulism and plutonium, which are really nasty things in small quantities, maybe we do want to command and control the creation and or treatment and or disposal if we have to of those. But for anything where a reasonable quantity is appropriate, maybe we want to use the price system. All right, I think that's enough for now. I think we've introed and overviewed enough. Now we're going to get into some of these things in some considerable detail, and we'll be using these models quite a bit. We'll be adding demand lines to this graph that say, hey, as long as the demand intersects short of Q prime, things are fine. We don't need any government regulation. We don't need any government intervention. We don't need anything to say that the price is not capturing all the costs, to fix the price. Once it intersects out here, maybe we do. And likewise, maybe there are differences in the way we move QE to Q star. Okay, we'll get into all of those things and how we tell and when we're there and when we're not. And some of the important differences are the politicians are more likely to adopt some than others, even though that some might be a little more efficient than others.